Hi, this is Kelly, aka Trixie from Ragnarok and Roll, a Scion to Ragnarok story, and Tilda Wimblewick from D&D Journey of the 5th Edition. First off, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for listening to our varied adventures, as well as for rating us on iTunes and rpgpodcast.com. If you haven't rated us yet, we would greatly appreciate it if you could. And if you're looking for more ways to support our efforts, we are now on Patreon, a great site where you can help us continue making more podcasts, as well as some special surprises for our patrons. If you can, please look us up at www.patreon.com/cppn. Every little bit helps. And again, thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Guys all having a good time? That's what we like to hear. Yeah, I am. Except for breakfast. That was not... What was that? It happens at so many cons, you know. They have a restaurant that presumably serves like regular breakfast, but then the fans arrive and they say, no, you have to eat this buffet here with these 4 tired-looking things. So this panel is just billed as an hour with me, I guess. So what I thought I'd do here is just sort of ramble incoherently for a bit, and then our moderator here will ask a few questions, and then we'll probably...
Normally panels start off with introductions, but does anybody not... There we go. Okay, thank you. Normally panels start with introductions, but does anybody not know who this is?
What does the RR stand for?
My middle names. So we've moved all the walls, and that has revealed more chairs. I've been told that this convention is very strict about chairs. No standing or sitting in the aisles that you see at some conventions. You must have your butt in a chair.
We have a very strict fire marshal. Other conventions that have been here.
Can you hear me?
Scott, can you get Zach in the enemy room? I can get it. Oh, wait, we got it, Scott.
Someone talk.
Okay. Hi. Hello.
Other guy talk.
Okay.
I can talk to you.
Go again.
Okay? Can you hear us now? Suspicious porcupine. No pops, no S's. Oh. Okay.
So who am I? The point was raised of who am I? That's actually an interesting point because I've been thinking about it a lot myself lately. Not only who am I, but why am I? Why am I the way I am? And this has been put in light for me by the recent election that we may have had. We have had this election, and I have expressed some opinions on my blog, which of course has gotten me a lot of attention and support in some ways, but also criticism, and there were some interesting debates about it, and it's caused me to think about why I have some of the attitudes that I have, some of the political views I have. And in reflecting on it, I think a lot of it is because I'm a science fiction guy. Yeah, I'm known for fantasy these days mostly, but of course, fantasy, when I was growing up, was like part of science fiction. Science fiction was much bigger. They're both branches of imaginative literature, as I see them. And I was born in 1948, so I largely started reading comic books and then books in the 1950s. I was reading the science fiction of the 1950s, the comic books of the 50s, and of course, before the science fiction of the 40s and the 30s, which when I could get that. And there wasn't much fantasy around then, not until there was Conan and then Tolkien came along in the early 60s. But mostly it was science fiction. And I wrote a lot of science fiction. I still love science fiction. I hope to write more of it one of these days. I grew up reading that stuff. And I look back on it now, and I think it's not the sole factor, but it's one of the factors that really shaped my political attitudes and where I stand in the culture war that is now dividing this nation and indeed the world. I don't know if you guys, and I know TusCon is a very old convention because evidently I was guest of honor here in 1980. Which I hardly remember, but I don't know if you ever had Gordon R. Dixon here. Gordy Dixon, did he ever come to a TusCon? Does any of the old timers remember?
We weren't able to get him.
No? Gordy was a great guy, of course, a terrific science fiction writer. And a lot of fun at conventions and at parties. He was known to imbibe a little. or a lot. This thing is really getting annoying here. I think it has to be turned back down. But the thing that Gordy never actually wrote, or never wrote because of the market forces at the time, but visualized. He had this grand idea for a series of 9 books that was going to be his magnum opus. And what he wanted to do was write 3 books of historical fiction, 3 books of contemporary fiction set in, the 50s and 60s, the time that we were living in then when he came up with this scheme, and 3 books of science fiction. And the 9 books would all relate together, and the theme of the 9 books would be the moral evolution of mankind. Because Gordy believed that there was moral evolution going on, and he would show in the historical fiction how things that were considered perfectly normal and natural in the past, things like patriarchy and racism and slavery and war, they were not considered evils. They were considered like part of the world that was, and the heroes engaged in these things. Good men owned slaves and engaged in these things. But over time, just as mankind and people had evolved, there was a moral evolution going on, and the attitudes of the contemporary were different, and the future would be still different. And it was a grand scheme, and I think I was one of the people. Gordy gave many interviews about this. He talked about his plan. But like everybody else, he had mortgages to build, to pay, and all that. So he wrote the 3 science fiction novels, and then they wanted more science fiction novels, and he wrote them, and they wanted more science fiction novels, and he wrote them. He never got around to writing the 3 historical novels or the 3 contemporary novels, so his grand scheme was never carried out. But I've always remembered him talking about it, and I think he made a very persuasive case for this idea of moral evolution. And I'm someone, and you can tell from my fantasy where I steal unashamedly from history, that I read a lot of history too, and I think there's evidence for what Gordy described. Now, history is not a straight line. It doesn't just go forward. It goes forward 3 steps, and then goes back 2 steps, and then it goes forward 3 steps. We can look at history, and there are some amazing ugly parts in it. I mean, I think in the early 20th century, they'd had almost a century of peace in Europe, and they really thought they had gotten somewhere and arrived at a new and kind of more civilized thing. But then World War I happened, and that kind of threw a monkey wrench into it and destroyed the society. And then after World War I, things got really funky, and then of course the Nazis happened, and a lot of people looked at it afterwards, how the fuck could the Nazis happen? I thought, well, we were really better than that, but maybe we weren't. Maybe that was just one of the step backwards after 5 steps forward or whatever. So history is not a straight line and all that, but I think by and large it's a straight line if you look at it. And the straight line is predicated, to my mind, on humanity coming together and becoming one people. And my attitude towards this, I really look to think, was shaped by the science fiction I read when I was young, by people like Isaac Asimov and Robert A. Heinlein and Edmund Hamilton and all of these guys. That, the dream of going out to the planets and going to the stars was a dream for humanity. Now, you can look at the stories they wrote and said, well, most people in them are kind of like white, male, American guys. And yeah, maybe they were, but they weren't labeled as white, male, American guys. They were called Earthmen or Terrans. We were all like one person. And there were some writers who played with this, even in the context of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and 60s. I was rereading a Poul Anderson novel recently, and Poul was another terrific writer about this. He was politically conservative, but he was also very much a humanist and like a globalist. And in a lot of his societies, there are like Polynesians and Maori characters and characters from Africa. Skin color didn't seem to matter to him even, and he reflects in his variety of Earthmen. He may have a spaceship crew that contains a Maori character and a Chinese character and an American character, but the political divisions are all gone. That's just their ancestry and their culture. They're all part of Earth. They're all part of whatever it was, the Polysotechnic League, or Asimov's first empire and all that. And we're facing off aliens. There's this thread there. And reading all these stories when I was young, I think really got me thinking that way. Thinking that we are one common humanity and we have more in common with each other. There are more things that we share than that divide us. And I think that's why I have some of the political attitudes I do. I don't really comprehend some of the arguments I've got in recently on some of the issues that divide us. About 6 months ago, I blogged about the Syrian refugees and why we have a humanitarian duties to let in the Syrian refugees, as many as we can take, because they're women and they're children and they're men too, and they're trying to get away from the war and trying to save their families, and they're in dire need, and that's what we're all about here, America. Give us your tired and your poor and your huddled masses yearning to be free, and also, the people who don't want to be tortured and killed and bombed. Even aside of yearning to be free, yearning to be alive is a powerful incentive too. And I remember I got in one debate with a guy who said, well, some of them might be ISIS spies and they're terrorists, they're coming in. And, well, yeah, some of them probably are. But most of them aren't, and in fact there's probably 1,000 who aren't, or 10,000 who aren't, for every one who is. And the guy I was debating with said, well, yeah, I don't care, but what if I don't want to let in even one? What if that one comes in and he kills 23 people in a terrorist act? And I said, well, yeah, then we take that risk, but number one, all the previous waves of immigrants have had some bad guys in them too. I'm descended from immigrants, from Italian immigrants, from Irish immigrants. Well, the Irish immigrants had a few terrorists in them too. People who were working for the Fenians and raising money and sending it back to attack the British. They were there too. And the Italian immigrants, most of them were perfectly hardworking guys, but they were the ones who were like the mafia. You heard of the mafia? So there's always some bad guys in any group you let in. There's no group you can let in, how much you vet them, who are like all good and all the time, and everybody is a saint. But you have to take the risk, right? We're led to the free and home of the brave. And the guy I was debating with said something. He said, "Well, I don't care. If one American life is lost because we let in someone we shouldn't, then the blood is going to be on your hands and the hands of President Obama and whoever lets them in." And that really struck me, the way he phrased it, one American life, because it's clear that he didn't read a lot of science fiction. He's thinking of American lives. I say, okay, so what you're saying here is that one American life is worth 100,000 Syrian lives, or is more important to that. And it really clarified why, maybe as a science fiction fan, my thought is different. I see these people who are ranking what they are when they talk about their own identity, and they say, well, I'm an American first, and a Republican second, and Arizonan third, or whatever it is, and a member of the Lions Club fourth, and etc. Or some of them put Christian ahead of American. Anyway, there's these rankings here, and I thought about that. And I'm not an American first, and maybe because I read science fiction, I'm a Terran first. I'm a human being first. And I have this sympathy for other human beings, no matter what side of the giant ice wall they happen to be born on. And I think I can see this reflected in my work, and some of that, not all of that comes from science fiction. I mean, obviously there were other influences on my life too that were important. I was born to a family in Bayonne, New Jersey, a very blue-collar family. My father was unemployed for a long period of time during my formative years. Well, it was only like a year and a half, but it seemed like 50 years, when you're a kid. So we were just living on his unemployment checks, and we were living in a federal housing project. It was an integrated project, so we had other people in there. We had black people, we had Jewish people. We didn't have many Muslims because there weren't any around then, but we did have a variety of different flavors of Catholic, which Bayonne mostly was. The Polish Catholic, the Italian Catholic, the Irish Catholics. In those days, a mixed marriage was when an Irish Catholic married an Italian Catholic, which was, like my parents. And of course, that's a powerful influence too. That sets your mind. So I didn't tend to think of like Jews as being something. I thought of Mark Shapiro, who lived in the apartment upstairs, and his older brother Eric, who was like the coolest guy I knew, and always had girls and stuff like that. And I didn't think of black people or Negroes, as we called them, as like separate. I thought of my friend Skipper Baker and his sister Dolores, who was my sister's best friend for a certain period of time. And they went to school with us, they played with us, they were all there, we were all like people together. So that was a powerful influence too. That's the value of kind of integration and people living with each other and coming on. You become people, you don't become these broad classifications, these generalizations. But science fiction was a big part of that too, because in science fiction I read about other things. I read the Tom Corbett Space Cadet series. Was the juvenile series I read first. Kerry Rockwell, which was a pseudonym, of course, 8 books about Tom Corbett, the Space Cadet, and the Polaris crew. And you look back at it now and you say, well, it's all like white guys. Yeah, it was all white guys. But one of them was a Venusian and Astro. And even though Astro was like a white guy, he got a lot of shit for being Venusian. You Venusians, they all smell bad, and do you really have webbed feet? And he got a lot of shit. And his friends, Tom Corbett and Roger Manning, had to stand up for their friend Astro, who was the astrogator or the engineer on the ship. And I don't think the science was rigorous. I think Astro was down on the engine deck where he was shoveling uranium into the uranium furnace. But nonetheless, it was like a lesson in prejudice and accepting people who are different from ourselves. So all of that helped, I think, shape the way I am, and I'm glad it did, because I like that, and I like these attitudes, and I like the fact that science fiction has always been on, I don't know, I guess you could call it the progressive side of the agenda, but you could also call it, to my mind, the humane side of the agenda. But even some of the people, I mean, we think of Heinlein as this arch-conservative, because he did become kind of militaristic and somewhat conservative in his later life. But number one, he was never really conservative. He was sort of a libertarian, and he was extremely liberal on some matters, like sexual matters. He had women on his starships. He had women engineers and women starship captains and women soldiers when nobody else was doing that.
I think it's safe to say that Heinlein did not believe that marriage was just between a man and a woman.
No. Heinlein believed in, at various points what's called free love, and later open relationships, and later, I guess, polyamory and so forth. But he believed in that in 1912 or something like that, when he was getting married. Nobody else believed in that then. It was pretty daring stuff. But he also had black characters. It's easy to lose sight when we look at Starship Troopers that Juan Rico, the hero of Starship Troopers, is Philippine with brown skin, in a book that he wrote in like 1958 and 59. So Heinlein was out there, and he was a Democrat, not only a liberal Democrat, but sort of a radical Democrat. He ran for Congress in California. He lost, but he was part of the Upton Sinclair campaign, End Poverty in California, which was well to the left of the New Deal. And he, you can read some of his letters when the first atomic bomb was exploded after World War II, at the end of World War II. And of course, Heinlein had wanted to fight in World War II. He was an Annapolis graduate. He was very patriotic and all that. But when that first atomic bomb came off, he wrote to some of the other science fiction with him saying, this is going to be our destruction. What we have to do, this means we really have to come together as one world. We really have to join together. And otherwise, this atomic bomb is going to destroy us. What we should do is we should give the secrets of the atomic bomb to the United Nations, which was just forming, and we should make them the world's policemen, and only the United Nations would have the atomic bomb in order to police the world. Now, the United Nations didn't turn out to be quite what I think its founders envisioned, and I think later than that was in 1945 that Heinlein was espousing those sentiments. Obviously, by 1960s and 70s, he had changed considerably. But the fact that he did have those opinions, I think, was interesting. And indeed, you read some of Heinlein's future history, and he's very prescient about some of the political changes that would be going through. I hope he's not too prescient about the rise of Nehemiah Scudder. Although recently I began to think maybe he was right about that too. And we'll probably find out in the next few years, but I hope not. Sometimes people make predictions about the future and where we're going, and they attach certain dates to it, or it's assumed that there's dates, and then it doesn't happen on schedule, and people say, oh, they were wrong. I don't think that's always true. I think sometimes just the timing is wrong. I think, people now say Malthus was wrong about the problems of population growth because it didn't happen exactly the way it said. Malthus was not wrong, he just got the timing wrong. Population growth will still overwhelm this planet and destroy all of us if it's allowed to continue unchecked. And people say Heinlein was wrong in that 1945 thing. Was he said this atomic bomb thing is going to destroy us all if we don't all get together and come together as one world. And then we can look back, and even Heinlein said, well, I guess I was wrong about that. Well, no, you weren't wrong about that, Bob. That was right. It just hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. It will happen. We avoided the big World War III with the Soviet Union, but as more and more countries get more and more atomic bombs, and I don't know how you stop that. You can try to stop it, you can delay it with treaties and things like that, but it's like knowledge, and knowledge has a way of spreading. You can't keep it secret, and it used to be one country had the atomic bomb, then two, now we're up to 12 or something like that. And it's not going to stay at 12, they're going to be more. And crazy countries like North Korea have it. That is a destruction that's waiting for us all, regardless of the timetable. Heinlein was right about that. So these are some of the things that inform my own thinking. And Heinlein also gave a speech at the Third World Science Fiction Convention, where he was talking about what makes science fiction fans, writers, and readers different from other people, what we would now call mundanes, although that's sort of a... And his theory was it was a capacity for something called time binding, the ability to think seriously about far future and past events, and rather than just the stuff that's immediately in front of them. And I think that's a good point. There's a certain amount of validity to that. At least I see that reflected in myself and some of my friends. I mean, as I watched this political campaign for the presidency go down this year, there were many things about it that horrified me. But one of the things, and you've all read a million postmortems about it, we've all been sunken in this for years. But one of the things that really struck me is nobody was talking about global warming. We had 3 debates, and there was not a single question about global warming. At one point Hillary said Donald doesn't believe in global warming, and he said, wrong. On the other hand, he has said that he doesn't believe in global warming, and he thinks it's a hoax by the Chinese. So, and many of the people on that side don't believe in global warming. But global warming is happening, whether you believe in it or not. The scientific community is there, and being a time binder and a science fiction guy, people are looking ahead at what's going to happen to them and their families next year. That's perfectly justified. We all think like that. We're all human beings. We're worried about what's going to happen to us and our family and our friends a year from now. Politicians are thinking what's going to happen in the next 4 years, because they're not going to get reelected unless they turn things around in 4 years. But I think it's only the time binders who are thinking, what's going to happen in the next 100 or 200 years? Because I guarantee you, 100 years from now, nobody is going to be talking about Hillary's emails. That's going to be in the history books with the Credit Mobilier scandal and the Teapot Dome scandal. And because we're time binders, there's probably a lot of people in this room who know what the Credit Mobilier scandal was and the Teapot Dome scandal was. But outside in the real world, where the people aren't time binders, those are like nonsense words. Also, 100 years from now, nobody's going to care about Billy Bush or how many pussies Donald grabbed. That's going to be remembered like Grover Cleveland's illegitimate child, or Warren G. Harding's mistress, or how many people John F. Kennedy shagged, which evidently was quite a few. Sex sells, as someone said on the previous panel, and we're always interested in salacious details. What they are going to be saying in 100 years is, guys, why were you talking about Hillary's emails when the oceans were rising and the ice caps were melting? Remember when we used to have a state of Florida, where now there's a bunch of small islands? Remember, you're worried about the Syrian refugees. There's 100,000 of them, 500,000 of them. What happens when the entire nations of Micronesia and Polynesia and coastal enclaves all over the world go under the waves, and we're going to have millions of boat people looking for a place to live. What happens in parts of India are having temperatures of 120 and 130 degrees just in the last year. I spent one night in Death Valley, and you can't, there's a reason they call it Death Valley. You can't live for long at 120, 130 degrees is the average temperature. People are going to leave those things and are going to start moving with their families because everybody wants to live and have food and have a life. You can't live at that temperature. So this global warming thing is kind of a big thing. It should have gotten a little more attention in the presidential election. So, but maybe that's because I'm a science fiction guy too and I'm doing these time bombs. Anyway, so those are my rambling thoughts about why I am the way I am and why I feel the way I do. And I don't know what to do about it except to keep